world. Now the roof seems coming.
Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. I'm one half of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, Mashal St. Patrick Hewitt, and with me as ever is my partner in crime, Santoki Nagulendran. Santoki, how you doing?
Yeah, Mash, I'm looking forward to this one. We're starting a new series, We've been getting requests for probably a year or two now to focus on each respective nation/island in the region and do a proper deep dive. And Mash, we could have done this by ourselves, but on the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, we like to get the best experts from the region. And we've done that here today. We're starting with the big one, Guyana, probably the nation who has the most passionate and divisive fan base. So what better place to start? And Mash, we've got an expert guest to come on and, deep dive into all of that. The history of Guyana, the past, present, the future, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, most definitely. I think when you put this out on social media, introducing that this was the series we were going to do, and when we said, right, we're going to start off with Guyana, we had a lot of people retweeting it, liking it, sending in questions, etc. People are obviously excited to see this series start off. And you said we're starting with the biggest. If we would have started with Jamaica, but I'll let you off. I'll let you off and say, you know what, we can start with Guyana. And do you know why we should start with Guyana? Because my favorite ever cricketer is from Guyana, and that is, of course, Carl Llewellyn-Hooper. So it's only right that we start with Guyana anyways. But I
thought you were going to say Shimon Hetmeyer there, Mash.
Now, Carl. Anyways, you know what I feel about Carl Hooper. But as you said, for each particular nation, we get a special guest on to kind of look at the kind of history of cricket within that nation, and as you say, eloquently put it, Santoki, the past, the present, and the future. So I'm honoured to have. We've had him on the show before, but only in like one of our live shows.
Yeah,
when we were doing a brief conversation. And what was the link again? You said that your grandfather,
my granddad grew up with his father in Berbice,
yes.
Guyana.
So for those people who remember that show, you'll know who the guest will be, and it is, of course, Basil Butcher Jr. And before I bring him on, for people immediately going, Basil Butcher Jr., as in what? The son of Basil Butcher, the one and only. Yes, it is. So without any further ado, let me bring on Basil Butcher Jr. onto the show. Basil, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys for having me.
Excellent. And you know what, Basil, like I say, we've been you and myself have been in touch probably for the best part of what seems like a year, if not longer now.
Yes.
Many a conversation offline about West Indies cricket. And to be fair, getting you on the show is long overdue. And when Santoki said we were going to do a Guyana special, both Santoki and myself said that you were the best guest to get on if we were going to look at Guyana in any amount of detail. But before we properly start, Basil, I think the best thing to do, and this is, lots of people listening to this will know who you are, but there'll be lots of people who listen to this who won't know your story in terms of cricket. They'll recognize the name, and they may or may not, as cricket historians, know about your father's exploits in West Indies cricket. But just give us your background in terms of your cricket involvement. You're still heavily involved now, but let people know what your involvement in cricket has been and is to this day.
Well, I always like to start, and I always tell people I've been a cricket, if you will, junkie. Started in my mother's womb because I was born in England. My father, when my parents were there, my father was playing in the Lancashire leagues. So I was born in a town in Lancashire called Rawtenstall. And so I've been around, fortunately, because who my dad is, been around West Indies cricket, been able to see things close up, hear them talk, many things, listen to my dad and all the great players they talking. You're listening, you don't understand. But as you got older, those things started to make more sense. And I was always keen about cricket. My dad would take me. My other brothers, they like cricket, but they weren't like me. So I would go with him to like when they had trial matches to pick the Guyana team and those kinds of things. And I played, but I left Guyana when I was 16 to come to United States University. So that dream of playing for the West Indies kind of went out the window the minute I left so young. But I still maintained the close contact with the game. I played here in the States, and I got into coaching. Professionally, I'm a strength and conditioning coach, and I work both in rehab and performance. So I've worked with many cricket teams, U.S. national teams at different levels. I've coached U.S. national teams, the women's team in particular, and coach in the area I live. And actually, at the moment, I'm working with a team here in a Masters tournament here in Florida, T10 tournament, as a conditioning coach and physio. So that's my story, and I'm a keen West Indies cricket historian. Something I've always been interested in since I was a kid.
Well, as you say, you're a keen historian, which is why we've got you on the show. But Basil, firstly, before we get deeply into the history, growing up in Guyana as a youngster, as a teenager, what sort of players stood out for you? Who did you sort of look up to in that Guyana setup around that period?
You know, I'll tell you, it's interesting. One of my first favorite players is none other than Forward Bacchus.
Oh.
Because you know, the first time I remember seeing Forward play for Guyana, I never forget it. 1973, I was like about 9 years old at the time, and he played. It was Australia against Guyana. That before the Test match. I think he made 30-something not out. But I just like the way Forward looked. He always had his white wristbands, looking neat, and in the field, he was so magnificent. How he moves and glides. I just loved how he played the ball and all of that. He was one of my first favorite players. And then my next favorite player was none other than Smoking Joe, Sir Isaac Vivian Alexander. And he was my favorite West Indies player. My favorite fast bowler was Sir Anderson Montgomery Everton Roberts. When I was really young, I wanted to be like him. And I got to about 12, 13, I realized I would never be a fast bowler. And I ditched that. But I loved Sir Andy, man. Oh, I loved him. You know, today, me and him, we are friends. I get to talk to him a lot. And I remember telling him one day, when I saw him play in Guyana for Leeward Islands, you know, he always had that real serious face, right? And he's sitting in the team bus after the game, and he's at the window, and I'm like itching to want to go, but his face was serious. I was scared. I didn't go. He goes like, "Man, I'm one of the most down to earth people you know. Don't let the face fool you." And obviously, after Richards, Brian Lara was my favorite West Indian batsman player. I haven't had one since. Lara is where I stopped. There is nobody I'm emotionally attached, but I'm still emotionally attached to the West Indies team.
What's quite interesting there, Basil? Obviously, you've named Viv, you've named Lara. You said Forward Bacchus from a Guyanese perspective, and I guess before we kind of properly go into the structure of the show, just immediately as soon as you said your answers, I wrote something down on my piece of paper, and I wrote down. Was there a sense? So you grew up in Berbice, yes?
No, a town called Linden. Linden. It's a bauxite town. Yeah.
Right. So that's even more interesting to me then, because when we talk about Guyanese cricket today, so we're going to go forward to go back. We tend to find, or I tend to find, Santoki might disagree. I tend to find that the Guyanese fan base are very protective of their own. And very supportive of their own. You could say that's the same anywhere. Jamaicans for Jamaicans, Asians for Asians, so on and so forth. But when you were younger, was it like that as well, in so much as primarily wanting to see the best for the Guyanese cricketers, or for your particular region within Guyana, etc.? Has anything changed in that regard, or was it always the same back when you were watching your father, etc.?
I think it still remains. It's always been like that, and it still remains like that. Because I'll give you an example. Some guys told me about Case Cup was the first division cricket in Georgetown. That was supposedly the highest level of cricket around in the country, and players from Berbice and so on clubs would bring them into their clubs. And there was a famous match. Rohan Kanai came down to play for what was called then Indians Cricket Club that later became Everest. And they were playing against what was then called BGCC, British Guiana's Cricket Club, which later became Guyana Sports Club. And a whole bunch of folks from the current team came down to see Kanai, right? And there a guy named Charlie Stayers who played for both Guyana and West Indies, fast bowler, was bowling for BGCC. Kanai opened the first ball of the game, cleaned him up, and all the folks from current team walked out the ground. They all went home. Right? And that also happened also when they would come down to see Kanai bat, for example, for Guyana or whatever. When he is out, they all left. So yes, that still remains to this day. It still remains. And I think that's the way it is throughout the Caribbean.
Yeah, well, you've mentioned the great Rohan Kanai, so what better place to start? Now, it's interesting, if you look at the Guyana team currently now, the majority of players are from Berbice, whether it be Hetmeyer, Romario, Shepherd, Sinclair. But previously, that was not the case. Berbice was always considered like a backwaters in Guyana. I mean, I guess due to the colonial legacy and the privilege in Georgetown sort of was the central for players making the British Guyana side as it was then and going on to the West Indies picker side. However, that all changed in the 1950s with an influx of players from Berbice, your father, Basil Butcher, Rohan Kanai, Joe Solomon, even Madre. Let's take it back. Did your father ever describe to you what it was like growing up in Berbice and playing cricket with a heavily dominated plantation environment around him, and sort of him almost being one of the first? I know there was a fast bowler, John Trim, who was the first first player from Berbice to play for West Indies. But really, there wasn't many players from Berbice coming through. So what was it like for your father growing up in Berbice and trying to play cricket at a high level?
And the interesting thing, he never even thought about playing for Guyana or the West Indies. Cricket was he just played cricket. And what was interesting, school cricket was so huge where he was. Like, if his school was playing against Kanai school, because they went to two separate primary schools, right? The crowd would be packed. Even I remember one Christmas holidays, there was a guy who lived with my grandparents. He came to visit us in our town, at our home, and my grandfather was still alive at the time, and he was recounting some stories of when my father, as a teenager, coming to the school cricket, and a teacher from the opposite school, Kanai school, was claiming my father was too old. He was already had a child. This is my dad is probably like 12 or 13, right? He don't want Butcher to play. And it was so this guy said he almost had to fight because say no, Basil is going to this school and so on. And you know, that was a kind of rivalry and the cricket he played, he played Dawson Cup. The guy who was a guy they call Sugar Boy Bajnot from Albion. He was like the star bowler because he had played for Guyana in the 40s, right? And my father told me when he knew that he could bat, he made 106 against Albion. Most of the runs were singles because Sugar Boy Bajnot, he would bowl 40 overs or 40 runs. That's how tight he would bowl. And he said when he made 100 against Albion, he must have been like about 17 or 18 or whatever it was. That's when he knew he could bat. But he said he had no idea of playing because in those days, as you correctly said, Berbice players from the Sugar Estates, whether it was Berbice or Essequibo or the East Coast and so on, got very limited opportunities to play for Guyana. So folks from those areas playing for Guyana was like something not really on their radar.
And you mentioned the Davison Cup. So for viewers who might not be aware of it, if I'm correct, that was a tournament organized by the plantation owners, or the bookers as they would be known, to sort of develop cricket on these plantations, right?
Yeah, it was the equivalent in Georgetown, what they had, the Case Cup. Davison Cup was the first division in Berbice. Yes.
And what was your sort of? Did you ever see Rohan Kanai play, or looking back on footage? Yeah. What's your opinion of the great batter?
Well, let me tell you, I still could remember my last impression was the last time I saw him playing Guyana in 1974. I was like 10 years old. Still could see him coming out, because some people may not know this, but the West Indies used to have 2 color caps. They had a blue cap, which was for home series. The maroon was for touring. And Kanai is playing for Guyana against England before the test match against England. And he could see the gray hair of the pulling out the cap. And I still could remember seeing gracefully just stroking the ball. That's my lasting memory of him the last time I saw him playing Guyana. But the times I saw him, I was really young. I saw him in 71, I couldn't remember much. 72, 73, and 74. But I was young, but the 74, I still could remember how graceful. So I could imagine how good a player he was, because that was like at the end of his career. I could imagine how good he was before.
And Machel, you'd be interested to know, contrasting Shimron Hetmeyer not being able to make the plane to Australia, I was reading in Rohan Kanai's autobiography, he talks about when he first got called up to the British Guyana trials in 1955 with Basil Butcher and Joe Solomon and Eva Madre. He had to wake up at 3 a.m., get a 4 a.m. bus to New Amsterdam in Berbice, cross the Berbice River by ferry, then get a train to Georgetown in order to play the match at 1:30 p.m. in Georgetown. So that shows you the struggle those days just to get a cricket match. And Basil, we were talking off air briefly about, you know, the sort of narrative in West Indies history is the importance of Clyde Walcott and his sort of unearthing these players in Berbice to sort of get them national recognition in Guyana. Sort of, what's your opinion in regards to all of that?
All right, well, I'm going to give you the true story. There was a guy named Robert Christiani who played with Clyde Walker. Robert Christiani was the personnel manager at Port Moran Sugar Estate. He used to practice and play with my dad and Kanai and Solomon and Madre. He was the one that recommended to Clyde Walker about these guys to come to Port Moran. The day Clyde Walker came to Port Moran, rain fell. So all he did was show a film. He didn't see them play. It was until when they went to Georgetown, that was on the recommendation, he saw them play. Because it's funny, we met a guy, my dad, this was in New York in the 90s, a guy who wrote a book about Sir Frank Worrell. And he had come over from Canada where he was interviewing all kinds of people. And I'd interviewed Robert Christiani, who was living in Canada at the time, because he passed away in Canada. And my dad told a story, and the guy said to my father, Christiani to this day is still bitter that Clyde Walker had received all this credit, and he had never been given the credit. And my father then told him a story. Barclay Gaskin, who was a cricketer, played for Guyana since from the 20s to the 50s. Barclay Gaskin one day said to Clyde, why don't you tell the truth about what happened in terms of Butcher Kanai Solomon? And Clyde Walker's response, well, they never asked me, so I let the story keep going, that I discovered them.
And, reading about sort of these stories about even the journeys from Berbice to Georgetown, it really gives the impression that, these might as well be two different countries in terms of the culture and the differences, even the landscape of the countries. Did you get that impression in Guyana, the sort of divisions between the counties in terms of how different they were?
Yes. I could tell you the stories from my dad. And, you know, you're talking about the thing with Kanai, talking about getting up in the morning. I remember because there was a guy named Mr. Plummer. He was the hospital administrator for the New Amsterdam Hospital at the time. And he was involved in cricket in Berbice. And the first time they went to Georgetown, he drove from New Amsterdam to Port Moran, put them in his car, took them to to New Amsterdam so they can catch the ferry to Rosignol and then the train from Rosignol to Georgetown. And then when they came back, he picked them up again and took them back to Port Moran. And my father would tell me, you know, when they started playing against the guys from Demerara, he would tell me they would sit on the train and match themselves up against the guys that they playing against in Georgetown. And he said to me, the one guy they respected, the rest of them, they knew they were way, you know, the one guy they respected was Lance Gibbs, you know. And the other thing in terms of you talking about the culture, you had this thing about country boy and tongue boy and so on. And those guys in Georgetown, my father always told me they would always call them country boy, this country boy, that, and whatever, and so on. And he said the thing they all had to get accustomed to when they went to Georgetown to play at Border was that they played on these wickets in quarantine. We call it boosie wickets, where it's loose and so on. Whereas at Border, well prepared. And he said as soon as they got adjusted to that, it was a wrap.
Would you say how entrenched do you think the county divisions are? Maybe this might be a political question. I don't know if Basil's ready for these type of questions. But no, how entrenched would you say the county divisions are still to this day? Or do you think there's a greater sense of, well, Guyana is Guyana, irrespective of which county the player is hailing from? So let's take Hetmeyer. Hetmeyer is the biggest talking point today. Just to use Hetmeyer as an example, will Hetmeyer's defenders primarily come from Berbice, or will it come from Guyana, for example?
No, they would come from Guyana. Right, okay. I don't think, I don't get the impression anymore the rivalry of Demerara versus Berbice is there like it was in the past. Because those games are really, you know, those were drag down knockout games, if you will. It was like for the bragging rights and that kind of stuff. But I don't get the impression, because this generation is not that, because for one, they took away the county game into county games for like 10, 11 years. So, and they just recently resurrected it. So this generation that had Myers and them, they would have played it in age group, but as seniors, they had never played it until this year. So I don't think it's so like it used to be. No.
And just before we sort of move on to the next set of players from Guyana in history, was there a particular innings that your father ever talked about as perhaps his favorite, or a memorable one he liked to talk about?
He says his best innings was the 133 at Lord's against England in 1963. He says that's his best innings he's ever played. He played it under difficult circumstances. One, West Indies was staring down defeat. That innings brought the game, swung the game. And then also he received a message during his inning from my mother that she had lost. She had a miscarriage. That would have been the child before me. So with all of that on his mind, he played the innings of his life. I have a book from CLR, written by CLR James, essays about cricket. And he speaks about that inning, and he refers to my father as that impetuous young butcher my father was at 92 and Derek Shackleton was bowling, and 2 consecutive balls, he chips down the wicket and hits him one bound for 4 both times. And he says, you do not do that to Derek Shackleton. impetuous Butcher. But those who have saw the inning live, they revel about how my dad batted it. He himself said that's his best inning. There was another inning in Guyana, for Guyana against Australia, where he batted primarily with one hand because the other hand was injured. He made 157. I heard many stories about that inning. Some of the shots that he played. That inning has been written about, but from his perspective, his best ever innings is the 133 at Lord's.
So we come out of what we'll call, for argument's sake, the Basil Butcher Rowan Kanai era. And as Rowan's kind of comes to an end in the World Cup final, the beginning of what most people, if you took a straw poll of most famous cricketers from Guyana, if people even knew he was from Guyana per se, they're probably, Basil, going to say Clive Lloyd, just because of Clive Lloyd's influence on the game in terms of manager, coach, player, captain, everything, right? And obviously Clive was captain of the West Indies from 74 through to 85. We barely lost in that time. He's seen as being the father of the kind of pace revolution the West Indies went under. He's seen as the father of the destructive team that beat all comers, etc. From a Guyanese perspective, let's start here. From a Guyanese perspective, though, is that the same kind of vision you'd say that people have of Clive Lloyd as kind of being, let's call him the father of, let's call him the father of West Indies cricket. Lots of people are going to take issue with that. They're going to take issue with me saying that. But let's just say that's how he's commonly almost referred to. So how would you say he is seen within Guyanese cricket specifically?
It depends on the generation you're talking to, right? Because a lot of the younger folks, they would have heard of Clive Lloyd. They didn't see him play. They would have heard of the exploits, when he became captain and West Indies became this all-conquering team around the world, and and so on and so forth. So I think it's the generation. If you speak to my generation or just below my generation, we have that reverence for Clive Lloyd. We see him as the father, if you will, of the modern West Indies cricket era. When West Indies, he took the team. There was a 60s team, which my dad played on. That was the team that kind of put West Indies on the map. But Clive Lloyd's teams took it to a different level where, they were the best team in the world for a long, long time. And so, yes, he would be seen, for depending on the generation, as that person. Because me, for one, I advocate that the stadium at Providence should be called the Clive Lloyd Stadium, because I feel like, in my opinion, he's the most decorated cricketer from Guyana that we've ever had, Clive Lloyd, and I feel that's a just honor to name the stadium after him. And then you put the names of the different eras of Guyana cricketers on the stand, so the young people would have a understanding of the legacy of Guyana cricket by, because now we got Google. You could go Google the name and see who these people are, because for lots of the younger folks, these folks are just names.
I mean, if Darren Sammy can get an international stadium for 2 T20 World Cups, I'm sure Clive Lloyd should be getting something in Guyana. But it's interesting, Basil, because I often think with Clive Lloyd that people talk about him, definitely with a reverence, in terms of captaincy and his role within the kind of wider development of West Indies cricket. But I sometimes feel that they forget he was an excellent batter in his own right. Is that me, or do you think people forget that he was actually a legitimate top-class batter in his own right?
Yes, people often forget that. I mean, the guy averaged 47 in Test cricket, right? One of the interesting things too about him is that for a guy who was a hard-hitting batter, he has one of the best averages against India. He's never spoken of in terms of his prowess against as a player of spin. Whether you say he was or was not, he found a way to be very effective against spin bowling that he averaged something like close to 70 against India, right? And he was adept against both pace and spin. I mean, as a captain, he averaged over 50, and lots of people often forget how good or great a batter he was during that time. I had a friend, I give you just from a statistical perspective, one of my friends who played for Guyana, one day we were in the park, because they know I'm the stats man. He said, Butch, I want you to check up these stats for me. I want you to check Viv against Clive when they played together. I don't feel Clive is far off of Viv. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. So I went home and I looked it up. And lo and behold, as all-conquering a batter Viv was like on the top of the world, you know. He scored about 200, a little bit over 200 runs more than Clive when they played together. And probably people don't realize that just shows you how much of a great player Clive was. You know, that Viv was the man, so to speak, and Clive wasn't too far off.
And if we're talking of that later generation who sort of just came after your father and Rowan Kanai, someone who made their debut, I believe, at Melbourne with your dad and Kanai, opener Roy Fredericks from Berbice as well. What's your opinion of him? How did you sort of what did you make of Roy Fredericks?
Well, I like Fredo. Fredo was a great character to talk to. I love watching him bat. I mean, he was, in terms of the way how aggressive he batted, he was before his time. He would revel in this era, you know, where, you know, from the first ball, you know, I mean, Fredo, in my opinion, and I've been backed up by others who played with him and so on, he's one of the most underrated batters in West Indies cricket history. People often forget how good an opening batter he was. I know some players who played with him that rate Fredo better than Gordon Greenwich, you know, better than Conrad Hunt. You know, I know people that say he is as good or better than all of them. You know, Fredo, I mean, as aggressive as he was as a batter, you know, everybody remembers the 169 at Perth against Australia in 75, 76. But then Fredo went to India in 74, 75 and scored 2 centuries in the 5 test matches. And he is, you know, people don't talk about him, but he found a way to score 200s against India, which was primarily a spin bowling attack in their conditions. And then in England, there was a test match. My memory, I can't remember exactly which one it was, but he batted a whole day. I think he was the last guy out. So he showed, although he could be aggressive, that he could come and do the marathon batting too. He was a fantastic player, and he was a character as a person.
Listen, Basil, there must have been something in the water in Berbice, right? Because when I was looking on, in fact, for your father's Wikipedia, confirm if this is true. Your father's Wikipedia says Basil Butcher was a neighbor of Alvin Kalitcharan's family. True or false?
True.
Right. So now, and so you have out of that particular area, you've got Alvin Kalitcharan's family, Rowan Kanai, Joe Solomon, just already people we've spoken about, but within that Guyanese era, what we'll call the Clive Lloyd era. So as we say, that 1975 World Cup, you have Kanai, who comes to the end of his career. We're just spoken about Roy Fredericks. And then we also have the emergence of Alvin Kalitcharan within that era as well. And when Santoki and I were putting this this episode together, I said to Santoki, where and how we're going to speak about Kalitcharan. and Santoki said, don't worry, we'll be bringing Alvin Kalitcharan in. So actually, Santoki, let me come to you because I know you want to talk on Alvin.
No, Alvin, obviously, we all know what a quality player Alvin was. But I'm going to start straight away, Basil, with a big question. Do you think his participation in the Rebel Tours has affected his legacy and the perception, particularly in Guyana?
That's an interesting question. Maybe, um, you know, maybe it has, but not for me. Um, and you know what's interesting? My dad told me about Alvin. After he came back, they came back from India, Pakistan in '59. He said they were practicing and they saw this little guy, the bat almost as big as him, batting and stroking the ball. And he said he turned to Rohan and he said, Rohan, who's that boy? And then somebody told him, that's Isaac's son, because Alvin's father's name is Isaac. And my father said he turned to Rohan and said, we got to make sure he makes it. And that Alvin must have been like about, because what he's born in, 1949, I think. So he must have been like 10 years old at the time, right? I told Alvin the story. He never knew that because when my dad passed, he called me and he was telling me how he used to come and carry my dad's bag to the practice in the afternoons. And he said his first cricket bat he got from my father. Yeah, he was a hell of a player. I was telling in the team I'm with here in Florida, the captain is Gautam Gambhir, another little left-hander, wristy. And I was watching him, stroking the ball in the practice and, knocking up. And it just hit me. I said, damn, he got a little resemblance of Alvin, how he bats, the wristy lefty, Yeah, I mean, I remember Alvin in 1977 against Pakistan. Him and Imran Khan going at each other. The faster Imran came, the faster he went. And it was a controversial LBW, and all hell broke loose. The crowd started throwing balls. The game got stopped for a minute. But yeah, he was that little man was a hell of a player.
Sorry, Santoki, do you want to come in?
No, I was going to say, I don't think you can summarize it any better, man. A really quality player. And
but you know something? I just want to add this. I just remembered when Ma said about something in the water. When Guyana was getting independence in 1966, when the Queen and Prince Philip came, Prince Philip being a keen cricket fan, him and the Queen made a special trip to Port Morant on the helicopter because Prince Philip said he had to see this place that produced Butcher, Kanai, and Solomon. He couldn't come to Guyana and not see this place. I have a picture. My mom has a scrapbook with my father's career. I have the scrapbook, and there's a picture of my dad greeting them at the Port Morant community center in his West Indies blazer. So when my father was telling me the story, he said, I bet you don't know about that one because I always looked up his career. And I told him, I said, yeah, I know about it because I saw it in the scrapbook.
Basil, there are people that will pay you hundreds for that, No,
they ain't getting that.
But also, Basil, just because you mentioned there, when your father came back from the 1958-59 tour of India and Pakistan, we got Mashel here, so I have to bring in a Jamaican player, even though we're talking about Guyana.
Oh no, I know what you're going to say. That
Roy Gilchrist, obviously the fast bowler. Yeah. Wasn't there an incident on that tour where he threw the ball at your father and got sent home or something to that effect?
No, this is what happened. Why I know this, Roy Gilchrist has been maligned over the years. And my father decided in the 90s to sit down and put all that lies to rest. And he wrote an article in newspapers. I wish I could, I think it was in the Chronicle or something, but sometime in the 90s. And he wrote an article about the whole incident, what happened. First thing, after the first test in India, my dad suffered a niggle with his knee. And he's going through fitness tests, and a ball comes close to his knee, and he jumps out of the way. Gilchrist turns to him and said, Butcher, if that ball hit your effing foot, you would have did. Right? And, Alexander now tells Gilchrist to apologize for using the curse word. And Gilchrist, you know, the class thing in Jamaica, Gilchrist said, "Wah!" Alexander then says, "I will not play with that guy." So he wanted to send Gilchrist home after the first test. And my dad told me there was big negotiations, like for the younger players like himself, Sobers, Kanai, etc. Conrad Hunt was their representative. Then you had the older players like J.K. Holt and etc. And they negotiated and everything got squashed. And it was until the very last match in India, they're playing, Gilchrist runs in and bowls a ball, and the guy, the name escapes me, he hits Gilchrist and asks Gilchrist how you like the shot. Well, that's the last thing you should tell a fast bowler, right? How you like the shot. Gilchrist bowls the next ball and bowls a beamer. And Alexander screams at him. I'll get you the name of the guy right now because I just pulled up this thing right here. It was against North Zone, and his name was Saranjit Singh. He went to Cambridge also like Alexander. And Gilchrist bowls him a beamer, and Alexander screams at him. And Gilchrist walks back to the mark and bowls another. And that was the end of his career. I can tell you some of the lies that's been proffered about Gilchrist. I heard Alan Davison, the Australian, when Alexander passed, repeating a lie that Gilchrist pulled a knife on Alexander in Lahore. Gilchrist never made it to Pakistan. From India, he came back home, right? And I could tell you what my dad told me. He said the value of Gilchrist was way more than Alexander could ever bring to West Indies team. That was something they were so pissed. Now, I mean, from a historical perspective, can you imagine Gilchrist, Griffith, and Hall and Gary Sobers in the same team in the early 60s? And then Lance Gibbs, as we would have had our 4-prong way before the Clive Lloyd's 4-prong, right? I mean, even when Alexander passed, and I told my dad, he still didn't have nothing good to say about Alexander. He said that value of what he did to Gilchrist was one of the worst mistakes in West Indies cricket history.
Interesting.
And see, Mash, this is exactly why we chose to get Basil on the pod, because it's these type of stories that aren't written in the history books and don't fit the narrative. So we're getting some scoops on this episode. But, this is the big moment Mash has been waiting for. The next player on our list, regular viewers of the podcast, we'll see him, talk about his favourite West Indies player of all time, Mr. Carl Hooper himself. Now, Mash, we'll go to you first. Exactly why is he your favourite West Indies player? What is the reasons? What made you fall in love with the play of Carl Hooper?
Well, first things first. Before I give my eulogy to Carl Llewellyn Hooper, I actually think that Carl Hooper is one of the most unfairly criticised West Indies cricketers in terms of people. There's two camps around Carl Hooper. There's the camp that say one of, if not the most stylish West Indian batters that they've ever seen, or you're in the camp which says the kind of standard marker for a unfulfilled talent. But I always question when people say that Carl Hooper's talent was unfulfilled, because when you actually look at what Carl Hooper did in West Indies colours, he averaged 36 in okay, some people are going to say that's not good enough, but he averaged 36 in tests, 35 in ODIs, 48 in first-class cricket. And then people always forget his all-round ability. He was a wicket taker. He was what people think Ruston Chase is today is what Carl Hooper actually was. Carl Hooper was a legitimate wicket taker with his off-spin, more so in limited overs cricket than Test cricket. And I'd argue because he didn't have to be used as much in Test cricket. He kind of was just a kind of hold up an end guy in Test cricket. Then you have to throw in his slip fielding. Carl was one of the best slip fielders in his era. I think he was one of the quickest West Indians to, 500 or 200 catches, X number of runs, X number of wickets, etc. So that's my big stats first and foremost about Carl Hooper. But I think we say Carl Hooper's era because Carl makes his debut in 1987. So we kind of say, let's call it now, in terms of Guyanese cricket, you come now to the Carl Hooper era. And he debuts at a time when West Indies are still good. And he exists through the period all the way through to when West Indies turn bad. Then, crucially, when Carl Hooper was made captain, I think people forget this. When Carl Hooper was made captain of the West Indies cricket team, he actually averaged what he should have averaged over his career. And if I'm
46.
not mistaken, Basil will correct me, but
46.
He was in the high 40s.
Exactly.
And he actually fulfilled that talent that people say he never fulfilled once he became captain of the West Indies cricket team. So, Basil, I guess with that all said and done, what do you make of Carl Hooper? And Santoki, just to answer your question, why did I love him so much? Because when I was a youngster, Carl Hooper to me was the most stylish player on the team. Like if Hooper was batting, I made time to go and watch Hooper bat because I knew that even if he was out for 20, it was going to be the most stylish 20 I'd see for the whole day. So I made time. That's why I always have Hooper in my head because he was such an elegant batter. But over to you, Basil. Carl Hooper.
I'll give you a couple of Carl Hooper's stories from my father's perspective. My father told me the first time he saw Hooper, there was a guy who played for Guyana named Rex Collymore. Rex Collymore tells my dad, Butch, I got a youngster I want you to look at. And when my father comes, he brings his kid. At that time, Carl was a little chubby. So my father said to Rex, Rex, what kind of fat boy you bringing here, man? Right? And Rex said, Butch, don't judge a book by the cover. And my father said, when Carl played the first stroke, he said, yes. No, I have a friend. He's in a WhatsApp group that Santoki knows. I call him Necker, Roger Boxill. We're at his club in Georgetown. My dad is there, and he's a Carl Hooper man. And he goes over to my dad and he says, Butch, what are your impressions of Carl Hooper? And my father says to him, Carl Hooper is the most technically equipped batsman he has ever seen. But the runs have not matched up to the ability, right? There's an interview with him in Australia where he talks about his career, very candid, very, about his career. The first part where he talked about when he heard he would be getting dropped, he'd make a score, stay in the team. That was his modus operandi. But when he came back after the retirement, it was a totally different. And so, we saw what could have been the Hooper that we all knew had the ability after he came back from retirement. But I'm gonna tell you, that guy made batting look so easy. I remember me and a friend, I was a Lara man, they were Hoopers, right? So before the test match in 1998 against England at Border, we bet $50 US who was going to make the most runs. Lara made 89. And then Hooper came into bat. And he made this thing look so easy. He gets to like 40, and I get so pissed. I said, this is 100. I lost $50. I walk out of the ground to go buy a snow cone. And at Border, when there are two different noises the crowd makes. When someone scores a boundary, there's a certain roar. You know the tenor of the roar. When somebody gets out, you know the tenor of the roar. And I heard the out tenor. So I'm rushing back to see who it is. As I rushed in, who I see walking off the field? Hooper, 48. Luckily, they had monitors in the pavilion. I run up the stairs to see how he got out. Dean Headley bowls a bouncer that would be at 6 stump, and he tried to hook from there. The ball just went straight up in the air. Jack Russell caught him. It's almost like he got bored, and just just let me see what I could do with this ball, because it was coming so easy to him. But I mean, if Hooper had done what he did post retirement as West Indies captain, we would be talking about him as one of the all-time greats, in my opinion. Because in my view, Hooper could bat with anybody of his era, anybody. You call him from Tendulkar, Lara, all of them. He could bat with any of them.
What's interesting, Basil, is obviously we haven't yet touched on Shiv, and I don't know if we're gonna. I mean, we probably will have to throw in Ronnie Sarwan as well. But when Hooper came about, Basil, were you already starting to see a decline in batsmanship, battership? We're focusing on Guyana, but within Guyana, because that's a big gap. When Hooper debuts in '87, we've gone from Butcher, Kanai, Solomon, Lloyd, Kalicharan, etc. There's a big gap between that and then Carl Hooper coming about in '87, who you'd class as the next big batter, so to speak. And then after Hooper, you've only got Shiv and Ronnie Sarwan to come. So were you noticing yourself at the time, boy, we're not producing the same quality of big bats anymore?
I think we had quality batters, but unfortunately, they didn't come up to scratch. I mean, Fawad Backus is an example. He came in 78, 79. I mean, he was so talented. I think he didn't even understand how talented he was. I heard my dad say one day, we driving home from the game, and he said that chap Backus could play shots I couldn't play. But he bats like he has a plane startup waiting for him. So, Backus is playing against Andy Roberts and comes down the wicket to Andy Roberts. How crazy can you be? This is Andy Roberts. You don't chip down to Andy Roberts. And he got cleaned up. I remember for about 3 years, I didn't get to see Fawad bat because we lived in Linden, which is about an hour and a half from Georgetown. And we never always came before start of play. By the time we get there, Backus is already out. So I never get to see the guy bat, And you had other guys in the early 80s. There was a guy named Andrew Light, opening batter. Unfortunately, he came in a time with Greenwich and Haynes, right? And, this is a guy that dominated in Shell Shield. I mean, Barbados team. He scored 100 in Barbados in no time. He scored 100 against them before lunch, and this with all the big bowlers, but, he didn't get a chance to play for the West Indies. You had a talented guy named Andy Jackman. He didn't fulfill his promise. He was a really talented player. So we had guys. Timur Muhammad is another one. You had another one, Rohan Kanai's nephew, Tyrone Etwaru. He was a talented batter too. His older brother, Romain, who was my high school biology teacher, he was a really talented opener also. But I think he went away for 4 years to go to university. And, when he came back, he played, but not as consistently. But there were still talented guys that, but you got to remember that West Indies team was even harder to make. Because when this is the 80s West Indies team that every season Shell Shield starts, there's no space really to get into the team. Just think about it. You're playing to get into the squad, not into the 11, as a batter, because you got Greenwich Haynes, Richards, Clive Lloyd, Larry Gomes. Who else was in there? There was Alvin Kalicharan for a bit. Logie got in 80, 83, 82, 83, and so on. So it maybe like there was one spot. So it was really, really tough. So I don't think it's so much the batting went down. It was the competition to get into a team that was so good was really, really rough.
And moving on, Hetmyer fans might cuss me, but Shiv Naran Chanderpaul, the last great proven batter Guyana has produced. We got an interesting question, Basil, on Twitter from Dan, who said, the lack of development in Guyana in terms of batters, how much of that is down to the talent drain in terms of, players like Clive, Lloyd not coming back to Guyana, staying in the UK, or players, former greats staying in different countries and not being in Guyana and teaching the next generation? How much does that play a part in the development of our batters, or lack of development?
I think the standard of cricket in Guyana has fallen away tremendously. I mean, that's across the region. But if we're talking about Guyana, it has fallen away. That, and you could see where it started really getting bad was in the 90s, because Trinidad at the time, their club cricket was employing players. So guys would leave and go to Trinidad to play club cricket because they were being paid. And you had guys not just from Guyana, from other parts of the Caribbean that would go to Trinidad. That's why you saw the Bravos and all of them emerge from that, because the standard of Trinidad's cricket went sky high and all these good players playing. And then we started to see the whole plethora of good players coming out of Trinidad. Well, Guyana was one of the countries that suffered. That you go see a first division game in Georgetown, and you're watching that guys who would never be in the first division team playing, because the better players from their club are all in Trinidad playing, right? So that played a big role in the demise of the standard of cricket. So now you as a batter, you're not playing up against quality players, so you're not being challenged. So you're not going to produce good players.
Now this match, you can answer this one as well. Shiv Narayan Chanderpaul, obviously the unorthodox stance, the sort of hitting the bells into the ground, the whole performance, and then just his consistency, whether it be playing county cricket in England, the fastest century he scored against Australia of 69 balls, his ability to dig in when the rest of the side was crumbling. Just how good a batsman was he, Mash?
I'm super intrigued to see where Basil goes with this, because in fact, I can remember some conversations we've had, myself, Basil, and Mark Harper have had about Shiv in group chat. But I think, Basil, in my defense, before you possibly come in with some critique here, Santoki and I, at the time that we were properly growing up as West Indies fans, we were seeing defeat after defeat after defeat, right? And you had Shiv as probably the last stalwart left who actually had legitimate international class, and at that world class. But what was intriguing to me about Shiv in the latter part of his career, and by latter part, I mean 2007 till when he was removed in 2016, in which his career average was basically, what, 70 plus across that 7 or 8 year stretch. There were plenty of people in the Caribbean that were willing to say, no, Shiv is selfish. He only plays for not outs. He doesn't rotate strike. He's the best bats in the team, so he should bat higher. Was Shiv a victim of playing in a weak team? Or should Shiv have taken more responsibility given his senior status and clear ability above everybody else in the side? Where do you... Because to me, Basil, Shiv is a great of West Indies cricket. You can't look at a man who should have broken Lara's record. I will still maintain they let Shiv go because he was in danger of breaking Lara's record. I will always maintain that played a role in Shiv being told to go away at that time, right? But
I have no argument with that.
you can't, ultimately, you cannot argue with a man who scores 11,000 plus runs for West Indies and had that career stretch from 2007 to about 2014-15, where he was arguably maybe the best batter in the world. But where do you stand on Shiv, Basil?
He's a great West Indian batsman, period. Let me bring my father perspective in. My father, from 1984 to 1994, went into self-imposed exile from cricket in Guyana because it was like a one-man protest boycott against the foolishness. People who were coming into administration had no clue about cricket, and he wouldn't be part of it. And he stayed away for 10 years. And it was me who begged him in 1994 to go, let's go and watch the President's 11 match between President against England at border. And Shiv, this is going to be the very first time you ever seen Chanderpaul bat. Chanderpaul made 4 runs. Nothing about the 4 runs he made. We're walking out of border at the end of the day's play. And my dad turns to me and says, that guy Chanderpaul is at, and I'm quoting him verbatim, that chap Chanderpaul is a damn good batsman. I look at him like, what? He only make 4? He said, no, skipper. My dad used to use that term skip a lot from his cricket vernacular, you know. He said, I saw a ball slow up on Chanderpaul, and he was in position and played it. He said, that is a mark of a good batsman. His prediction was right. He hit the nail on the head. Chanderpaul turned out to be a great West Indian batsman. I think Shiv made a decision very early in his career that he was going to play the way he played, because there are those who might not realize that, as Santoki stated, I saw that. I was live at border when he made that 69 ball 100 against Australia, right? Shiv had all the shots, but he chose that, you know, this was the way I felt he would stay in the team, was the way he approached it. I don't think it had much to do with weak or strong West Indies team at the time, because he played like that pretty much throughout. There were times when he could be aggressive, and he showed you that he could play all the shots in the world. Look at how he opened in the ODI team. You know, I mean, if he was this plotter, how could he be opening in the ODI team and was very successful at doing it? You know, I mean, he was a great player. I saw him from his very first game in '94, that test match at border, and he made 60 odd. You know, you could see from then this guy was the real deal. You know, he was the real deal. You know, and he wasn't. And the thing about him, it didn't matter what kind of bowling he could play, the fast and the spin. He was a great player, period.
But hold on, Basil, you didn't answer the question then.
What's that?
Or you were ducking under my bouncer. Should Shiv have batted higher in the latter part of his career?
I will say this. I agree that he should. I remember hearing Rahul Dravid talk about it, and I agreed with him that he should have gone up. But again, he had his way. He said, no, I ain't going up. You know, I'm not in his mind to say why. You know, so I'm not going to speculate on a worldwide thing. I would probably tell you in private what my thoughts are on that. But I agreed with Rahul Dravid that he should have gone up and batted up higher, because that was a big issue in the West Indies, and he insisted he's not going up. And many of us was like, damn, man, you should go up. Take the brunt. You the man in the team. That you know, and we know as West Indians, our number 3 batter is usually the bad man in the team. You know, you go all the way back, you know, from the Kanai, the Viv Richard, Lara. You know, the number 3 guy is the guy that, you know, is the star bat in the team, and he was clearly the star bat in our team, heads and shoulders.
You're on mute, Santoki.
Sorry, before we move on to the final part of modern players, you mentioned it twice there. Border Cricket Ground, obviously a landmark in Guyanese cricket history. What was it like for yourself, the experiences there watching cricket at the ground?
Oh, man, it was electric. Let me tell you, you know, sometimes those of us who had the opportunity to go to border, and we reminisce about, you know, when we juxtapose Providence to border today, it's like cheese to chalk, as we would say. You know, you hear the stories of people lining up outside a board at 4 o'clock in the morning to get into a test match, you know, and I'll give you an example to show you at border. Pakistan came to the West Indies in 2000. The test match started on Thursday. Border was about 75% filled. I remember Tony Becker came and he was on a radio on Sean Divas' television show that night. And he made a statement. He said he was flabbergasted to see on a Thursday the ground 75% filled. He said that would never happen in Jamaica. You know, Border, I mean, it was electric, and like if you were able to go into the pavilion, you were so it's like at Lloyd's how the guys walk through the long room. You there when the guy gets out of walking in, he's walking past you, sitting there in the pavilion. It was I mean it's a shame that Border is the oldest cricket ground in the West Indies, and the ground, the place. I mean, when you go, those of us who remember Border, you walk into the ground now, like tears will come to your eyes to see how the ground has gone from what it was in its heyday.
And we're talking about the rich history of Guyanese cricket. Guyana hasn't hosted a test match in about 12 years now, Basil. What's going on?
Hey, I don't know. These days now, we only get 2 test matches, right?
Yeah.
So that I think that plays a big role in getting a test match in Guyana. Because I heard that the English for one don't want to do with Guyana. I've heard that through the grapevines of West Indies cricket. Therefore, one don't want to come and play in Guyana. I guess it's something to do with the whole thing with the Barmy Army and the whole tourist thing, and Guyana doesn't present that, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's a real shame. Test cricket doesn't play there. It's been a while. I mean, that was something. Every year I would travel from the US to go back home, at least to see the test in Guyana and maybe go to see another one elsewhere in the Caribbean. But that was a staple in my calendar from the late 80s to the 90s to the 2000s until 2008 against Sri Lanka. That was the last time I saw a test match in Guyana, when the first one played at Providence. It's a shame.
No, it really is a shame. Basil, before we finish off by looking at the modern, the most relevant modern era, I'm going to quickly tell you a story. About 3 years ago, the very first West Indian player, I'd say major West Indian player we got on the podcast was Ramnaresh Sarwan. Anyways, after we released that podcast, I'll always remember this. Santoki went on a he went on a Facebook group which was specific for Guyana cricket. And I'm paraphrasing, but Santoki posted the episode in that Facebook group, and it was strictly about Guyana cricket. And I think the tagline that Santoki put was, "Hi, we're the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. We've just done an interview with Ramnaresh Sarwan, who was a great of West Indies cricket." Something along those kind of lines. And Basil, the amount of cussing Santoki got for suggesting that Ramnaresh Sarwan was a great in Guyanese cricket. Never mind West Indies cricket, just in Guyanese cricket alone. Santoki got cussed to the point where he had to just delete the post and take it off the group.
I think that's unfair of those fans because they don't understand Sarwan's ability and what he did, play his record. I met Ronnie when he was 15. He got called to trials. I happened to come home for the Christmas holidays, and they had one trial match left. And me and my cousin go over there at the police ground, Evelary it's called. And when I walk in, Travis Dowling, whom I knew, said to me, he called me, he said, Basil, come over. And he introduced, he was sitting next to him. He said, meet my friend, Ronnie Sarwan. He came to trials there. He was 15. He didn't really do much, I saw when he batted. The guy was earmarked. He was just like Hooper. Hooper was earmarked from early. So as soon as Carl made his first score, albeit he did it in Barbados, which is a big deal. Usually when you make runs in Barbados, you get put into the West Indies team. But Sarwan was of the same. He was earmarked. This was a guy that was supremely talented from the beginning. Now, those who want to say, yeah, you know, they're comparing him with the Lloyds, the Canais, the Butchers, the Fredericks, Cali Charans, etc. Carl Hooper, also Chanda Paul. Yes, I mean, he doesn't measure up to them in terms of what he did for Guyana. But in his own right, he was a tremendous player for Guyana. You know, he was tremendous. I mean, those guys that I called before, I mean, those are guys, most of them average 60 and 50 something odd runs playing for Guyana, which Ronnie didn't do. But in terms of ability, he's the last good batsman we produced.
Well, do you know what? I'm so glad, because I was just about to hand back to Santoki, and literally, Basil, I was just going to say, you know what? Sarwan might be the last good batter that Guyana actually had. And Santoki, I hand to you with Basil having said it before me.
No, but that's a good segue, because the next name on our list is Leon Johnson, and obviously a lot of people might see us bring up Leon Johnson in the same episode as we're bringing up Kanai and Butcher and think, you guys are drinking too much El Dorado. What's going on? But in the context of Guyanese cricket, from 1965, when the Shell Shield began, 4-day competition, till 2014, Guyana only won the title 5 times in those 49 years. Leon Johnson obviously captained the side to 5 wins in a row between 2014 and 2019. So he has to get a mention in terms of modern cricket. Basil, my question to you is, do you think Leon Johnson deserved more of a chance playing for West Indies, more opportunities, bearing in mind his accolades? Or do you think his success as a captain was more reflective of the declining state of the regional game, and he sort of just wasn't good enough for the international level?
Well, there are 2 questions there. The first one, I've actually argued. I argued this. I thought when he went to South Africa on his first tour, that he should not have been, well, it wasn't his first tour, I think. Whatever, he should not have been dropped coming back to the Caribbean, because here he went to South Africa playing against probably the best bowling attack in the world in their conditions. Stain, Morkel, Philander, and who was the other one? I can't remember. But
I want to say it was Andre Nell, maybe, but I can't remember.
And I think he did a credible job. If memory serves me correct, I think he may have scored a 50 or got close to 50 in one of those games. And then to come back to the Caribbean up against England, and he's dropped. You know, I have argued that forever. Why was Leon Johnson dropped? I think he was unfairly undone there, you know. Now, in terms of the Guyana winning all those years, not to take away anything from Guyana, but the Guyana team that was able to win over those years was a team that had been playing together for years. So they had a nucleus, unlike the other teams which would lose. And that Guyana team also never really lost anybody to international cricket during the season, like unlike Barbados and other places, right? Because we didn't have anybody in the teams. So Guyana was usually playing at full strength over that period of time versus the other teams. So, I mean, I'm not saying that wasn't a great achievement, but we got to put it in context.
And where do you, talking of that modern group of players, where do you stand on Veerasamy Permaul? Obviously, he's someone who's taken so many wickets at a regional level, has never really got a consistent run in the West Indies Test side. Where do you sort of stand on that? Is he similar? Do you feel like he deserved to have got more opportunities in that West Indies side?
I think the Veerasamy Permaul is a victim of poor handling of spin bowlers historically in the West Indies. West Indies have done a piss poor job in developing spinners. They seem to expect guys to become Lance Gibbs. You know, the standards that Lance Gibbs put up there, everybody now was supposed to ascribe to Lance Gibbs. So you get a guy, he plays 2 games, he don't do nothing, he's out. Right? Spin bowlers need a run to develop and so on. Because I'll give you an example. Nicky Boye from South Africa played 40 test matches. Nicky Boye is an ordinary left arm spinner. And we have had guys in the West Indies that had they gotten the opportunity like Nicky Boye, they could have probably done as credible a job as him. You know, it's funny you're talking about that. Bishu is here playing in this tournament here in Florida. And we were having a conversation about this same subject last night. And I told Bishu, I was doing some research. And, you know, for the first 13 test matches I just looked him up. And then I kind of something told me, let me compare him with West Indian bowlers across the board. You know, Bishu, first 13 test matches compare favorably across the board with all the great bowlers in West Indies cricket history. But people don't even know that. You know, I mean, I'm not going to repeat some of the things he told me because this is a conversation, but the same thing I'm talking about, the mishandling of our spinners. There was a guy from Trinidad, Jagger something. He was an off spinner.
What, John Ross?
He played against Australia in the early 2000s. I think the Steve Waugh team. Damn, I'm trying to remember his name. I can probably look it up. But I remember him playing. Colin Croft was commentating. And he bowled the ball to Ricky Ponting. And Ricky Ponting hit him for 4. And Croft made a point. That same ball that he bowled there, in a first-class game in the Caribbean, the batter would have played a defensive stroke. And Croft was saying, now he's going to understand the difference of the level and quality of batter, that when he plays his next test match, he would, or even as he continues, he will make the adjustments. Well, he never got the chance to play another test match. He played that one. We never heard of the guy again. You know, Dave Muhammad is another one from Trinidad. Chinaman bowler. The guy was around the team for several years and played 3 test matches. A bowler, a Chinaman left arm spinner, and we never gave him a chance to groom, to develop. You know, Ram Narayan is another one, the leg spinner. He quit at 28. He was done at 28. You know, and we could go down the list of guys that never got the opportunity to develop because I call it the Lance Gibbs syndrome. They always expecting Lance Gibbs again, you know, and that don't happen overnight.
The Trini spinner you meant was Amit Jagannath.
That's right.
Jagannath. Yeah.
That's it. That's it.
So listen, Basil, we'll bring this one to an end by looking at, I guess, what the modern Guyanese cricket is now. And just before anybody comes in the comments and says, oh, but what about Colin Croft and what about Roger Harper? And because people say we've mainly focused on batters. There'll be a part 2 for Guyanese cricket, people. So don't worry. We haven't forgotten people like Colin Croft and Roger Harper, etc. But I guess this is the best place to end, Basil, in terms of you, myself, and Santoki know that whenever anybody talks about Guyanese cricket today, you can't get past one sentence without Shimron Hetmeyer's name coming into the conversation.
Right.
There was a report done on the debacle at the 2022 T20 World Cup, which referred to Shimron Hetmeyer as the Dennis Rodman of West Indian cricket. Hetmeyer is now back in the fold once again. We don't know how long he'll stay in the fold for this time, but I use Hetmeyer more as a kind of signal point to say, so where do you feel Guyanese cricket is at now? What is its relevance? And you could make the same point for Jamaica cricket, Barbados cricket. So this isn't, we're just talking about Guyana. What is its relevance in 2023? Do you look at the West Indies team and see a Gudakesh Moti, a Kevin Sinclair, a Mario Shepherd, and feel actually there's a bit of a Guyanese renaissance in terms of players being part of the West Indies setup? Or do you look at things like the Guyanese government pumping all of this money into the CPL festival and say, well, boy, Guyanese cricket is more about CPL now and that festival, and appealing to the expat and diaspora communities to come back to Guyana for CPL. We just saw Guyana bid for the short format games against India. Where is Guyana cricket right now?
Guyana cricket is, has been in the doldrums for a long time. Like many of the parts all over the region. One of to start off, our structures have deteriorated as they have throughout the Caribbean. I mean, for example, there's no school cricket in Guyana. School cricket was that was the place where you started. That's where you got interested in cricket. And then you went and joined a club. Well, the club and school cricket, those two entities, the foundation has deteriorated, to that sometimes it's almost unrecognizable. I talk to friends who played cricket, played for Guyana, and I one friend, he played for Guyana, and he's from the quarantine. I remember when he went home, and when he came back, he called me. He said, "Man, I drove by the grounds where I played the school cricket. Now it's a pasture." That kind of thing. I think in Guyana cricket, there's too much politics, as it's West Indies cricket across the board. We might be somewhat unique in terms of the amount of politics in our cricket, and our cricket, the cricket, and one of the things I would want to say, and this is something I learned from my father. My father always said this: all cricket in the Caribbean is West Indies cricket first, and everything else second. And he said, every decision that you make, you must always ask yourself one question first: is this good for West Indies cricket? And I think across the region, that is not the question that are asked in the territories. They ask what is good for their cricket in their specific area, or their guys, or whatever. They never ask, is this good for West Indies cricket? And until that becomes the mantra, we're going to continue to see this continued deterioration of the cricket structure, foundation of Guyana's cricket. I mean, look for example, in Georgetown, the first division cricket, they play 2 days. And I was railing against this 2 day. Why not 3 days? And one guy said to me, "Butch, even though we play 2 days, a game finished in a day and a half." Right? I have a friend, who played youth cricket for Guyana. One morning, he calls me. My phone run about 6:30. I'm like, what the hell he calling me for? I answered just because I don't get calls from him that I thought something was wrong. And he called me to rant. He had run into two guys who were currently in the Guyana team. And he asked them if they had ever batted 2 sessions for their club team. And both said no. So he then said to them, how the hell do you expect you could bat a session for Guyana if you never even batted 2 sessions for your club team? And that's a microcosm of where it is. My position that if you're going to play the 2-day, play 1 inning and have each team bat 90 overs so that you will get the benefit of guys learning to bat long and bowlers learning how to bowl and get batters out and be disciplined and patient, etc. But they're playing 2 days, and these guys are still playing the 2-day thinking it's a rush. So the game ends in a day and a half rather than, whatever, our cricket needs a complete overhaul everywhere in the Caribbean, and we're talking about Guyana. Guyana, it has to get a complete. What's going on now is not going to change the circumstances because, we got some guys in the West Indies team as other places, but none of them are world class. None of them. You can talk and say he's like Sammy said, Moti's world class based on what? Getting all those wickets against Zimbabwe? He didn't do nothing against nobody yet. I don't know what the hell Sammy's talking about.
but you know what, Basil? Thing is, if you can, and this is political, give a quick synopsis, because I'm not certain, Basil. You and I have discussed this off this channel. I'm still not certain to this day if the rest of the Caribbean fully understand what was going on in Guyana cricket. What, no less than
10
in the
plus
last 10 years, in fact, because you had I don't even fully understand. I'm sure, obviously, Santoki has more of a view on it than me, but there was a cricket board that effectively wasn't running. There was government interference. You had Sanasi doing an absolute madness, and people. The issue I had was that people were acting. It was all. Sorry, let me start again, Basil. It was almost as if everyone was turning a blind eye to what was going on in Guyana, as if it wasn't going on.
I agree.
Do you get where I'm coming from?
I agree 100%. Here's funny. When my dad at my dad's funeral at the repast, Charlie Griffith came from Barbados to the funeral. So at the repast, we're telling him about what's going on in Guyana cricket, and he was like, "What?" I had no clue. Right? Well, I'll give you a little brief synopsis. The Guyana is 3 counties: Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice. Each county has a cricket board that oversees the cricket in the respective counties. So Guyana's cricket is somewhat a microcosm of the West Indies, how it's organized. You got the Guyana Cricket Board, then you got these county boards that run the cricket on the ground, right? The only time the Guyana Cricket Board gets involved in organizing cricket is inter-county. But in terms of club cricket, etc., they have nothing to do with that. We used to have national club competitions. One was called the Bristol Cup. That's no longer in existence. The Guyana Cricket Board would be the ones that would be in charge of that, but that's not there. So you have that, and each board has 9 delegates that would vote for the elections for the Guyana Cricket Board, right? So here again, like the West Indies Board, you got 2 coming from every island. Well, here you got 9 for those 27 total votes. Well, in I think it was 2011 or 10 or something like that, the Demerara Board had an election, and coming after that election, there were 2 sides claimed they won, or something of the sort. It went to court and an injunction. So essentially, there was no functional Demerara Cricket Board. My eldest brother at the time, his name is Keith Foster, was the president of the Berbice Cricket Board. And they were not going to participate in the national elections. And he tells me the story. Just before the elections, he get a call, y'all come and participate. So they head down to Georgetown. So traveling with him being one of the delegates, there were 6 other delegates from Berbice with him. They get to border where the elections were being held upstairs. And one of the delegates' son was upstairs, ran down the stairs and said, Mr. Foster, there are 9 Berbice delegates upstairs. Now he's coming with, including themselves, 7. They have 9 delegates upstairs, right? My brother said he flew upstairs, went and sat down next to one of the delegates, who was a legitimate delegate, and he read out before the meeting, these are the names of the 9 Berbice delegates. And he said he was able to convince the other person, who was at that time the assistant secretary, to not participate. So 8 of the Berbice delegates left, did not participate in the election. There was no Demerara board, so there's no Demerara delegates. Yet an election was held in which the Barbados president was sent there by Julian Hunt, as the West Indies board, rep or witness. And I remember quoting him in the newspaper. This was a free election. I was like, what are you talking about? Right? So Sanasi is in there. They said it's a free election, right? Where there was no quorum because you don't have the 9 delegates from Demerara and you don't have 8 from Berbice. So 17 of 27 people were not, that would be part of an election, didn't participate, and they called it a free and fair election. That continued, that election impasse continued in Guyana. You had then Clive Lloyd was working as a consultant with the government sports, and the government then tried to take over, not necessarily take over the cricket, to kind of like reorganize, because of this impasse, and they appointed this interim management committee. Now the West Indies board jumped on this ICC thing of government interference. I mean, really, it wasn't really government interference. If every board in each territory is subject to the laws of the country, if you are not abiding by the laws of the country, the system there has a right to sanction, right? And that's what they were, something along those lines were trying to do. And as a result, you had a situation where you had two Guyana teams being selected, two different coaches, and all of that kind of stuff. One by the Sanasi group and one by the IMC, right? And then that was when West Indies board said Guyana will not get no international matches, right? That's when that started, with that whole fiasco going on. It continued for years. You talk about blind eye. Cameron came to Guyana when they had the Guyana board, what you call it, the awards dinner. Then, Guyana had won like 3 or 4 in a row and made a statement that Guyana's cricket is in good hands, with Sanasi. And a lot of people didn't understand that how could Guyana be winning and the board is so dysfunctional? I had to explain to them, look, cricketers are not produced by the Guyana Cricket Board, just like West Indies cricketers are not produced by the West Indies Board. The cricketers are produced in Georgetown by the Georgetown Cricket Association, East Coast to a lesser extent, and Berbice Cricket Board, right? That's where the players that were playing for Guyana were coming from. It wasn't the Guyana Cricket Board. So the Guyana Cricket Board could be dysfunctional as hell, but because those boards that were below it running the local cricket, that's where the players were coming from. And so, we had this impasse for years until the current government came into play and they lifted the injunction. They had elections. But as far as I'm concerned, you got a new set of guys in there and it's the same old going on. Ain't nothing changed. You just, it's like you move the chairs on the Titanic. You just reshuffle the chairs and the same old nonsense is going on. If anything, from my perspective, looking outside in, it seems more political than it was before, which is not good.
I think we couldn't ask for a better breakdown of the whole situation with the political landscape in Guyanese cricket. But Basil, just to wrap up, we talked at the top of the show about how cricket in Guyana had always been centered around Georgetown. And if you were from Berbice, for instance, you didn't really have a chance of getting exposure. In modern day Guyana, we've seen the Berbice Cricket Board under Hilbert Foster. They brought in Curtly Ambrose, Andy Roberts, Roland Butcher for workshops. There seems to be some sort of structured development at different age groups. Would you say now there's a complete shift in Guyana in terms of if you are a young cricketer who does have aspirations to develop and make the Guyana side or the West Indies side at some point, you are better off being in Berbice than Georgetown?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Because in Berbice, they play a lot more cricket, way more cricket than any part of the country. And that's the reason why you see more players coming out of Berbice for that reason. They're simply playing more cricket, period. In Georgetown, even to this day, it's an interesting thing. I was listening to Sean Davis's show several months ago, and there were 3 guys from different clubs in Georgetown. And one guy from the police club was talking about his first and second division team. And Sean Davis said, what? Y'all got first and second division team? He said, most clubs in Georgetown now, if they have a first and second division team games to play on the same weekend, they can't find 2 teams. And when I could just talk from my era growing up, clubs had 3 teams because there was one was called the Case Cup, North Court, and White Cup. You know, so you joined the club as a youngster. Depending on your level, you will get into the White Cup team. You did well. You got promoted to the North Coast. You did well. You got up to the Case Cup team. Like the club I grew up in, they had two. They had a White Cup and a Case Cup team, right? So that was how you progress. Now today, you got first and second division, but according to these, I'm going according to what they say. If you got games on the same weekend, you're not going to find two teams. Most clubs cannot find two teams.
Well, as you said, Santoki, we couldn't have asked for a better guest to kind of deconstruct and break down Guyanese cricket. As ever, I'm expecting people in the comments to well, do you know what? If you've got a problem, blame it on Basil, people. I'm fairly certain we're going to have lots of people with various different comments about this. But I think the most pertinent thing that I've kind of taken from this, amongst all of the history of Guyanese cricket, is actually what Basil described it, and I'm sure we're going to hear similar stories when we look at Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, etc. Is that if there's dysfunction, and this is the thing, Basil, if there's dysfunctionality at the territorial level, why would there be anything other than dysfunctionality at the senior level? And this is why Santoki and I always say on these shows, how is any one West Indian head coach or even Cricket West Indies themselves, you can't you like we're basically asking a West Indies head coach or Cricket West Indies to polish something into diamonds when there's dysfunctionality, when people are coming out of dysfunctional systems. So I hope what you've said has given people a bit of an insight to some of the wider kind of historical context of how we've got to where we've got to, and why the road back from this is going to take some level of real joined up thinking to ever benefit West Indies cricket. Because to be fair, Santoki just mentioned Berbice, right? Even on a Guyanese level, that makes little sense to me. So Berbice are trying, and the Berbice Cricket Board are doing their best to improve cricket in Berbice, but that's not uniform across Guyana. So if it's not even uniform across Guyana, how's that then going to help West Indies anyway? That's just helping Berbice. So even on that kind of minor level, it's not. It's not. The dots aren't connecting.
I'm going to finish with a quote from my father again, as we had talked about him starting. I remember many years ago. This must have been in the early 90s. He said to me, he said, "The West Indies board is made up of the representatives of the territorial boards. And if you have SHIT at the territorial level, you're going to get SHIT at the West Indies level. So you have to clear up the SHIT at the territorial levels if you expect West Indies cricket to move." That was like over 30-something years he told me that. And we never diagnosed that issue. Folks were trying to paper it over, never addressing it, and now it's staring us full in our faces because they didn't listen to people who understand that was our problem. We could have solved this a long time ago.
Well, the people asked for a comprehensive history and analysis of Guyana cricket, and I think it's certain to say Basil has delivered. It's been a learning experience for both of us, if I speak for Mashal as well, and it was an absolute privilege to have you on the show, Basil. As always, we'd probably love to have a part 2, as Mash alluded to earlier. There's some players like Colin Croft we haven't even talked about yet. So for anyone listening on the show, if you want a part 2, comment on the video, message us on social media, and if there's anything you feel we didn't cover, let us know, and we'll be sure to bring that into part 2. But I'll hand the final word over to Mash.
Yeah, as you said, Santoki, thank you so much, Basil, for coming
on.
Thank
you. Thank you guys for giving me the opportunity.
No worries, man. And as you said, the quote from your father there is exceptionally apt. And like I say, I hope people have kind of, just from this one episode before we move to the next nation island, have got an idea of the difficulties, and the realistic, I should say, difficulties West Indies face if they're to even have any kind of cohesive system that then has a knock-on impact for both our men's, women's, girls, boys, etc. teams in all the various representative groups. But thank you so much for coming on, Basil. This has been
thank you.
The Caribbean Cricket Podcast. Thank you everyone for listening as ever. We've been Machel and Santoki. Thank you and good night.
We rule the cricket world. Now the rule seems coming.
Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans.